Hello, welcome to the lecture titled The Truman Doctrine Part 2. If you go to slide 2, you'll see the last slide that I had on the PowerPoint presentation for the lecture titled Truman Doctrine Part 1. And just to recap, remember the Truman Doctrine was this a statement coming from President Truman that the United States will be committed to containing communism to where it already exists. Communism will not be allowed to expand into one more inch of soil. The United States is committed to being the world's policeman and protecting the world from these villainous communists who are trying to take over the world. So what we have with the Truman Doctrine is an all-in approach to this Cold War. And President Truman, establishing the Truman Doctrine, is really setting the table for the way the United States will approach the Soviet Union, communism, throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Every Cold War president adheres to the Truman Doctrine, be it Truman himself, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, all the way up to George H.W. Bush. And really, the Truman Doctrine and new manifestations continue all the way up to our present moment, as the United States still consider itself somewhat of the world's policeman. Now, we talked about how the Truman Doctrine was first implemented in Greece and Turkey. The United States ponied up hundreds of millions of dollars to the pro-capitalist factions in Greece and Turkey, which provided them with the resources necessary to defeat their communist counterparts. And the Truman Doctrine proved to be successful through military aid, not military aid in terms of deploying American troops, but military aid in terms of flat-out cash that could be used to purchase military equipment. Now, the next big place in which the Truman Doctrine is going to be put to the test is Berlin. And you'll recall from the Truman Doctrine Part 1 lecture, Berlin was this important industrial city almost smack dab in the middle of Eastern Germany, which was under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union. And there was a big problem for Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union because Berlin itself was partitioned, Eastern Berlin being communistic under the aegis of the Soviet Union, and Western Berlin being partitioned into three other zones, France, England, and the United States, which of course adhered to the capitalistic model. Now, many of the more intelligent, or shall I say skilled, prosperous citizens of Eastern Berlin were chafing under communism. Doctors and lawyers and engineers, those who in a capitalistic economy could demand higher wages and greater compensation, really did not favor the communistic model and chose to vote with their feet and move over into West Berlin. Now, this was somewhat of a brain drain for the Soviet Union and Eastern Germany. They were losing some of their brightest and most capable citizens. And Joseph Stalin wanted to do something about this, so he acted in a pretty draconian way. He actually put up checkpoints around the entirety of West Berlin, and chose to attempt to absorb West Berlin into Eastern Germany and thus into the Soviet sphere. Now, this was problematic because it meant that there was going to be a difficult time moving goods and people across Eastern Germany into Western Berlin and out of Western Berlin and into the rest of the world. It seemed as if, to many people, this was a real threat to freedom and liberty for those who lived in West Berlin. But this posed a particular problem for Truman because he has committed himself to the Truman Doctrine, and if West Berlin is absorbed into East Germany and therefore absorbed into the Soviet sphere of influence, that means communism is going to spread into West Berlin. And of course, that would be a violation of the Truman Doctrine. And so what is Truman going to do about this? I mean, we're talking about a half of a city boasting of a population of approximately 2 million. Will Truman respond heavy-handedly? Will he send in the armed forces to make sure that West Berlin remains part of the capitalistic world? Or will he let Berlin be reunified under communist control? What will be the response here to this newfound issue? Well, there's a big issue here for Truman, because the last thing he wants to do is trigger World War III. And he certainly is always cognizant of the way that public relations can really swing one direction or the other. Remember, this is a global contest between the Soviet Union and the United States. The entire world is watching. If the United States goes in with guns of blazing, then the rest of the world might see the United States as hostile, overly aggressive, and maybe even barbaric. So Truman is desperately looking for some sort of peaceable solution to the issue, a way of enforcing the Truman Doctrine and making sure West Berlin remains part of the capitalistic world. And so if we go to slide number 4 here, we'll see that Stalin has surrounded West Berlin. He's closed all the checkpoints. He's created all these checkpoints and closed access to the outside world. So what will the move of Truman be? Well, Truman becomes very creative. He decides that maybe he can fly in resources, give people the ability to travel into West Berlin or out of West Berlin through airplane travel, and it makes sure that West Berlin has access to the consumer products and the food and water that they are dependent upon. And so really the idea here is to make a chess move. The United States has made its move. It's going to keep supply lines open, allow for travel to and from West Berlin to continue. Will the Soviet Union respond by shooting one of these airplanes out of the sky? If the Soviet Union does shoot one of these airplanes out of the sky, then blood will be on the hands of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union collectively. And if World War III does break out, the United States will be justified in going all in trying to completely destroy the Soviet Union. And at the end of the day, Joseph Stalin was not willing to shoot one of these planes out of the sky. After several months goes by, the Berlin airlift proves to be victorious. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union open up those checkpoints, and overland travel gets to recommence. And Truman looks to be successful not only in preventing communism from spreading into Greece and Turkey, but he's also able to prevent communism from spreading into West Berlin. So Truman is, I guess you could say, 3 for 3, Greece, Turkey, and Berlin. And he, of course, is pretty pleased about his abilities to navigate his way through such a contentious and difficult problem and come out not only as somebody who favors peace and wants to avoid warfare, but also somebody who has resolve, has a backbone, and who is not going to simply utter lofty rhetoric, not only unleash these bold notions such as the Truman Doctrine, but actually enforce them. And so he's feeling pretty good about himself, but he anticipates there being all sorts of problems like this popping up throughout the world. He wants to be ready for it. And so we actually get the creation of the so-called national security state. And this is a clear indication that the United States is institutionalizing to make sure that the Truman Doctrine can be enforced wherever it needs to be enforced, and to make sure that the United States has the leg up in its contest against the Soviet Union here in the throes of this Cold War. Now, the national security state is going to have 5 major components. One of the ideas is to really take advantage of its atomic monopoly. The United States is the only country in the world here in the 1940s, or at least for most of the 1940s, to have An atomic weapon, of course, the United States used 2 of them on Japan, forcing Japan's surrender. But there's an anticipation that the Soviet Union will develop their own atomic weapon. The idea is that the Soviet Union probably will develop one maybe by the mid-1950s, and there will be a nuclear arms race that ensues as a result. So why wouldn't the United States want to get a head start on this and pump a bunch of money into its nuclear program, develop more atomic weapons, develop more powerful nuclear weapons, develop a hydrogen bomb, a better deployment, more sophisticated deployment systems. And so a lot of expenditure goes here, a lot of taxpayers' dollars goes into nuclear armament. Also a bigger traditional military. Truman did not always want to rely on the nuclear option, so to speak. Instead, he wanted to be able to deploy in a flexible sort of way the Marine Corps or the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. And so there was a huge increase in military expenditure. Really, by the time Truman leaves office, we're looking at approximately 60% of the entire federal budget going into defense, into things like building up our nuclear stockpile and growing our traditional military, but also providing aid to friendly nations. Truman does not want to go it alone. He wants allies. He wants countries to stave off communism themselves rather than relying solely on the power of their big brother in the United States. A good example of this would be Greece and Turkey, where the United States' first line of defense against communism was to provide the pro-capitalist factions in Greece and Turkey with enough monetary resources to have a first-rate war machine that would enable them to defeat their communist opponents. And this is going to continue. The United States is going to continually fund the war efforts of particular factions in particular countries around the world. Number 4, we have the establishment of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. This is really a clandestine organization geared towards working behind the scenes. This is what you might refer to as kind of a shadow government. A lot of the most important work is going to be done in the shadows of the world. The assassination of pro-communist dictators or the assassination of democratically elected communists, the use of propaganda, smear campaigns against unpopular leaders. The CIA, of course, is going to be very important here in the Cold War. And we'll talk more about the CIA when we get to Eisenhower's New Look Foreign Policy in Module 3. Certainly the Soviet Union has their own clandestine organizations. They have their KGB. But the Cold War is all about cloak and dagger. It's all about assassination attempts and manipulations of economies and hiring of thugs and big sacks of money with unmarked bills, and it's things that it undertakes really are not exposed to the American public. Some people think that it's a necessary evil. Others think that if we have a government by the people, for the people, everything needs to be transparent. Perhaps there's a middle ground that can be achieved there that seems reasonable. But when the CIA is operating really outside of the national discourse, you can understand that it takes on anti-democratic implications. But nevertheless, it's a big part of the national security state, big part of the Cold War, and remains a big part of U.S. foreign policy today. You think about the storming of the compound in Pakistan that led to the assassination of Osama bin Laden. That's all behind the scenes, kind of cloak and dagger stuff. Certainly sometimes those activities seem to be perfectly justifiable, but there are also instances in which the CIA toppled democratically elected leaders because those leaders did not favor positive trade relations with the United States and its allies, and that certainly can pose a problem and lead to some difficulties further down the road, as we'll talk about again when we get to Eisenhower's New Look Foreign Policy. And then alliances. The United States is going to really try to establish very clear military alliances with countries. Military alliances are pretty simple. An attack against one is an attack against all. And the dominant Cold War military alliance for the United States, you'll see on slide 7, was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which is still around today. The Soviet Union is going to respond with its own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. If you go to slide 8, you'll see the countries in green are the countries that belong to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. An attack against one of those countries is deemed to be an attack against all of those countries. It includes many of the countries throughout Europe and the United States and Canada. You can see Greece and Turkey are part of NATO, Italy, France, Western Germany, which is now reunified at this point. Western Germany is, at least. Norway, Denmark. There are some neutral countries, Ireland and Sweden and Switzerland. Yugoslavia is communistic but remains neutral in terms of joining these military alliances. And then you see in that kind of pinkish color the member nations of the Warsaw Pact. And so we've got a clear Cold War that has been formed. A huge amount of monies are going to go into military buildups. International relations are going to very much be on steroids. Cloak and dagger, clandestine activity through organizations like the CIA, and these military alliances are formed, and nuclear buildup is going to be very much a characteristic of this Cold War as well, as many people become concerned that the Cold War will turn into World War III with nuclear capabilities. World War III would, many people fear, ensure that there would never be a World War IV, because World War IV would include the use of nuclear weapons, which would ultimately lead to Armageddon, the destruction of the entire planet, and with it the human race. This becomes really a concern to many people throughout the world after the Soviet Union develops its own atomic weapon in 1949, much earlier than U.S. policy experts had anticipated. But this is not the end of the game. You see on slide 9 a photograph of the Soviet Union's first atomic weapon, but the United States and the Soviet Union keep their scientists hard at work, developing ever more sophisticated weapons. The hydrogen bomb that is developed just a couple years later is about 500 times as powerful as the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. More powerful and sophisticated deployment systems, such as MIRVs, which are missiles that can house numerous nuclear warheads that can reach independent targets. So one missile can actually hit presumably 3 or 4 different targets. And ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that can be launched from one corner of a globe to the other corner of the globe. And so there's this dark cloud hanging over the Cold War as a result of both superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, gaining access to these super weapons. So this is the conclusion of our Truman Doctrine Part 2 lecture. And when we come back for the Truman Doctrine Part 3 lecture, we'll talk about how the Truman Doctrine is implemented or not implemented, depending on the country in question, throughout Asia. Okay.